Dugo na kong braso.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, before I begin my speech, I would like to thank everyone. It has been a dream to be debating in the Grand Finals. With that being said, we think that opening opposition has been adamant with respect to how they project ASEAN as a bloc, because there are a few characterizations that they haven't been able to reconcile from Rene's speech. The first is the fact that ASEAN as a bloc is non-interventionist. I mean, these have consequences to a lot of things. Their idea of the ASEAN projecting any kind of hard power doesn't reflect any kind of political reality to us. Because the fact is, with any kind of tussle that the ASEAN has as a region, it has always resorted to resolutions which it does using the non-interventionist clause. Like, for example, with respect to the human rights violations in Myanmar, it has never chosen to be confrontational about these issues. So all the social realities that opening opposition was trying to say as to the interest of the ASEAN projecting its power across the international community, that's not going to sell. Because the truth is, and I'm going to show you later on under my substantive, the growth of the ASEAN is inward, not outward. This is going to be the case of the Deputy Prime Minister. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue three levels of issues. The first is the principal part, the answer or the question of closing opposition, why ASEAN should cede, what it's going to get out of it. The second is with respect to the analysis of the actor of China. I'm going to ground this with respect to how prevalent the threat of China is and the palpability of an escalated war. And finally, I'm going to look into the consequences of the balance of power, which is obviously an issue the leader of opposition tried to extend in this debate. So firstly, the principle. Why do we think ASEAN should cede the Spratlys? The first is, they have already accepted, for example, certain realities that they can negotiate principle for the sake of economic benefit. The first is when they accepted Myanmar. Despite the fact that Myanmar has grave violations of human rights, the ASEAN bloc has moved away from these kinds of principles and accepted the fact that it's more to their interest to accept Myanmar because of direct economic benefit. What's the relevance behind this analysis? The relevance behind this analysis is that China is a vital trade partner. Despite the fact that we are confronted with principles like, for example, territory, for example, sovereignty, the ASEAN has always been, in precedence, removed itself from those kinds of calculations and favored more the economic benefits represented by the markets of China. We also say that the proportionality of need is also falls from their side of the house, because China has many influences that ASEAN doesn't have as a bloc. First is that it has already extended its influence to Africa within this kind of situation. The fact that it has extended aid towards these regions means that ASEAN no longer has the buffer of the West as an economic wedge that acts that, for example, if the ASEAN sort of privileges the claim of the Philippines and says, we are going to unite as a bloc and we're going to defend this country, we think that they're losing out more on the kind of trade bargain that China poses on the ground. It worked in the past because there was the West to cater to our needs. Like, for example, if the Philippines had any significant trouble economically, the United States was there, readily available to hand in aid. These kinds of social realities are no longer available right now. That's why we say that China is more of a realistic market for the ASEAN to assume, despite everything that we're going to talk about with regard to the proximity of ASEAN and China itself. So we need them more. We think that this kind of reality has to be accepted by the opposition bench. The second issue is with regards to the analysis of the actor of China. Before I go on.
Sir, if you offer to buy Chinese products, why would you need to give them the Spratlys in order for China to accept trade with you?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that question underneath this issue. How will this lead to geopolitical stability? Because we have to analyze first how China reacts with regards to issues like territory. First is that the extent and power of ASEAN as a body means that it has certain degrees of structural weaknesses that it cannot afford. For example, I'm going to compare this with respect to NATO, with respect to the Eurozone. The difference between the Eurozone and ASEAN is that at least with the Eurozone, there is a collective interest to protect all the member countries within it. The difference with the ASEAN is that it is weak with respect to trying to protect individual countries from the threat of a large market like China. What can China do to to ASEAN or individual member countries. The first is that it has levels of economic arsenals, like the yuan currency. This is something that ASEAN can compete as a bloc because it doesn't have any single currency like the euro. And secondly, it also doesn't have any kind of economic comparative industry that the West already enjoys. We think that they are disadvantaged with respect to that kind of debate. The second thing is also the massive kind of producing industry that China has on the ground. We think that ASEAN as a bloc cannot collectively agree and say, let's compete against China. We don't think this happens on the ground as well. That's why any kind of dialogue between China and ASEAN cannot realistically happen in this debate. That's why we think that we need to accommodate the Chinese interests. Because one, we think that the Spratlys is a valued contention from China. I'll give an example. When territory is sparked with Chinese delegates, it's always a sensitive rhetoric that demands China to respond militarily. It did this with Taiwan. We think that the same kind of threat will also be realistic when ASEAN as a bloc chooses to side with the Philippines or any of the other ASEAN claimants. The continued tension will be harmful because it will not be good for the ASEAN. Why? Because the ASEAN privileges stability within the region. The threat here is not just any kind of military threat, for example, in Taiwan where they post, missiles within the region. It's also with regards to China's capacity to perform a naval barricade against these regions. We think that their analysis saying that ASEAN can respond is just ridiculous. Who's going to respond to the Chinese Navy? The Philippine Navy, who absolutely doesn't have any kind of... The Korean Navy, whose jurisprudence is only limited to its shores. Here about Malaysia, we don't think that it's going to be realistic for the ASEAN as a bloc to respond in this way. That's why we think as a consequence, the balance of power is already conceivable. We accept the economic reality that China is more powerful than any kind of Eastern country within the world. That's why we say that the ASEAN's interest to growth has to be inward. It has to improve channels between member countries and not argue with outward influences that China is doing right now. ASEAN's interest is protecting these kinds of lines. China is going to threaten that if we do not secede the Spratlys. We think that that kind of social reality is something that opposition's model has to reconcile in this debate. For those reasons, we are extremely proud to propose.
Thank you, sir. Let's welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
The main fault of the opening government is that they've been very absolute about the description of China. We think in status quo that China is very much susceptible to constructive diplomacies with the ASEAN nations and constructive negotiations with other claimants of the Spratlys. What does this mean? It means that China recognizes international law and China recognizes that the ASEAN bloc as a collective body is a threat on its own, that it requires negotiation and it requires diplomacy to prevent any form of engagement that may be harmful to its economy and to its political stability. We think that economic stability on their paradigm cannot be, or the economic instability in their paradigm will not happen regardless if the ASEAN cedes the Spratlys or not. We think, discussed by Marco, proximity demands that kind of negotiation entry. We think that China, in status quo, isn't only the nation in Asia that is having an economy boost. We think that in this kind of economy boost, that Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia is experiencing right now. We think it's just justifiable for China to actually have negotiations with these nations and to actually consider as its utmost priority its relationships with even the Philippines and Malaysia because of the economies of these countries that they need for their trade and that they need for their diplomatic concern. Sit down. We think that on a risk level analysis, we think that China's threats are no more than empty threats because we think that the risk is more for them or more harmful for their economy if they continue those threats, or more than that, Mr. Chair, act act upon those threats at the end of the day. We think, Mr. Chair, that sending naval ships to Spratlys from the Philippines, from China, and from Vietnam is a valid exercise or just a legitimate exercise of their protection of national security. Because coming from the opening government, they have yet to qualify what kind or what really is a threat in this situation. Because threat in this situation, Mr. Chair, can be checked by the international community. The same way that China, Mr. Chair, is really, or at least very much susceptible to criticisms from the international community. Even the United States of America is susceptible to that kind of indignation or criticism from the international community. Talk about Guantanamo Bay being actually closed because of the indignation, or at least the criticism that's coming from the international community. We think that that kind of threat is not really a grave threat because it can still be under those checks and can still be monitored by the ASEAN as of law. They told you that ASEAN is not really that concerned with human rights violation because it wants to be in board, or at least it wants to maintain its economic stability over that. We think that ASEAN has been taking drastic steps lately in order to address those human rights violations. That's showing that they're actually rising to that level. Number one, they forced the Philippines, or at least they told the Philippine government to negotiate with MILF to prevent further human rights violations to be occurred on behalf of the Philippine government. Second, they actually supervised the elections in Myanmar, or become individual bodies, Mr. Chair, members of this House, to intervene so that the government of Myanmar won't actually do any harm to the people while elections are happening. Second, they portray the ASEAN as having structural weaknesses. We concede that ASEAN as a collective body is not yet at par with the European Union, not yet at par with any collective body, Mr. Chair. But it doesn't, because it doesn't have a singular currency or economy. But that's just the trend. In collective security organizations, such as the European Union, it started with the same kind of problem. And in this situation, we think it's the perfect litmus test for the ASEAN to demonstrate its collective security capacity to the nation, especially in China. What's the problem? Sit down. In context of Asia, where nation states are vying for ownership of the Spratlys, wherein you have China versus Vietnam versus Philippines, and other claimants who don't really make much noise. For example, Malaysia, it also a claim, but doesn't really act upon that claim. We think that the gravity of the situation is very diverse, because the threat that they've been portraying is about threats that comes from newspapers in China or state-run newspapers that says that we threaten to declare war on the Philippines. But then again, you cannot say that those newspapers are representative of what actually the government wants to do or enact upon in that situation. Mr. Chair, we think that those threats have yet to be substantiated by the government for those threats to be really valid at the end of the day. How do you solve it? That's the case. That's what is substantive, because we're going to go as any other way, but not to see Spratlys to China. Number one, you can declare the Spratlys as a neutral territory. What can China say, Mr. Chair, members of this House? Because it dilutes the sting of China's clamor for access to Spratlys' natural resources. At best, Mr. Chair, you could do in this paradigm is that you create a deadlock, because no one in this capacity now have the capability to access resources of the Spratlys, Mr. Chair, and members of the House. Not any nation in ASEAN or not China itself. Second, you can divide it under the principle, Mr. Chair, of common ownership. Concede, Mr. Chair, that China may continue to bitch about that situation. But what can they do at worst? That clamor is no longer justifiable because now, equal access to those resources and the same islands that China is vying for control. How is it better? Number one, it doesn't portray a weak ASEAN. Because an ASEAN, it portrays an ASEAN that is ready to address an impediment on the level of collective security. But before that, yes.
Sir, the non-interventionist clause was created because countries didn't want any kind of business with other countries in the region. Isn't your model going to compromise that? Because now you're going to force Singapore to respond to the Philippines' problems.
It's not just the Philippines' problem, Mr. Chair, and members of this House. If we take a look into the situation, members of the ASEAN, such as Vietnam, the Philippines, even Malaysia and Indonesia, do experience the problem and have the same claim over those islands. The problem, Mr. Chair, members of this House, is we want to have that kind of security that can be felt by those nations who belong to ASEAN. Number two, Mr. Chair, you delimit China's aggression. Because as of law, you portray an insurance of protection that these nations can have as a form of deterrence, Mr. Chair. You cannot assure in your paradigm that aggression will not be or will stop at least. Because in your paradigm, you give more precedence to China, Mr. Chair, to actually act upon other territories which it lay claims upon. Because there's no threat, Mr. Chair, that can readily stand up to that kind of threat. How do you, that's second case,
It weakens ASEAN consolidation as a body.
The premise is this, because once you go to their paradigm, it's a decision of the body that's mandatory and executory to all its member states, such as the Philippines and Vietnam. However, not all members of ASEAN lay claim to those Spratlys islands. For example, Thailand, and all others are passive about their previous claim. It portrays a regional body that makes a lot of compromises, Mr. Chair, without putting its members at premium. It puts, Mr. Chair, the premium of the security, Mr. Chair, of bodies who don't really have claim over those regions. It doesn't see the primordial concern of its members, Mr. Chair, and members of this House. You don't achieve the end goal of ASEAN as a regional body at the end of the day. And for all those reasons, we are very proud to oppose.